What's up, everybody? Thralls Metal here once again. I'm the Croc-Neck, and I am back with some States of Metal here. And this time, we're going to go out to the plains and go check out Nebraska's metal scene. Another one that's kind of small, but I did find some cool stuff, and I definitely had to do some digging for it. But I found some cool stuff nonetheless. So let's talk about Nebraska, the Cornhusker State. Named that way probably because there's a lot of corn, and husking it might be one of the few things to do there. In the US, this state is pretty much commonly known as a flyover state because outside of like Omaha, there's really not a lot going on there in terms of like urban activity. It's a lot of sprawling cornfields and just flat land. In fact, the name of the state translates to flat water, which I assume was just because the state's flat and there's water there. Still, like any state, it does have some things that, originated there. Arbor Day, which I think is kind of odd because, again, it's mostly kind of like open prairies. So a holiday, centered around trees, just it doesn't seem like the right place for it to originate, but that's where it started. It's also the birthplace of Kool-Aid, which is, all right, that's pretty cool. And it is the birthplace of the Reuben sandwich. That's where that awesome sandwich came together. And it is also the home of Spam for people that are fans of that salty meat brick. Despite it being like pretty much a giant cornfield or an open prairie, there are some cool things to check out there. Chimney Rock, I think, is a really cool geological feature out there. And there's also the Lied Jungle, which is the world's largest indoor rainforest. This state was the birthplace of some famous people like Gerald Ford, Fred Astaire, and Marlon Brando, who all left the state because, kind of boring there. In fact, the state's flag actually features a train leaving the state, which, I don't know, kind of tells you a lot about the state. And yet another interesting thing that I knew, but I always forget because I look at this band and nothing about them screams Nebraska. 311 is from Omaha, Nebraska. Which, yeah, if you look at them, they look like they were born in the back room of a PacSun store. Or a beach. I mean, honestly, it seems like they've been disguising themselves as Californians since like 1990. And of course, like any other state, this state has some weird laws, which again, has become kind of my favorite thing to look up in terms of like just weird factoids. First one that came up was that people with STDs can't get married, which I feel is kind of like counterintuitive. Like if they're willing to like lock down and kind of stay with one person, whether they have an STD or not, or both of them have STDs, you are kind of like limiting the spread there technically. Like this is the only person they're gonna bed down. And they're not going to be out there sowing their wild diseased oats with the rest of Nebraska. I also found out that at one point in this state's history, it was illegal for a bar to serve beer unless they also served soup, which is just strange. First off, it's a bar. I don't go to bars for soup. And second, why soup? Why couldn't it be like French fries? Why couldn't it just be like bar food? Specifically soup. But again, these are weird laws. They don't make sense. And I doubt they're ever really enforced. Or if they were, it was probably a long time ago and people were just like, you know what, maybe this is stupid. Why the hell are we even bothering with this? Like this little nugget. Apparently parents can be arrested for their child burping in church, which in my experience, which, I don't go to church. I really didn't spend much time in churches at all, but the people that I know that did go to church, I'm pretty sure a child burping in church was solved immediately by a smack upside the head. A quick what the hell is your problem and a smack upside the head seems to solve that more readily than actually calling the cops and then jailing the parents for their asshole kid. Then again, if I was an asshole kid, I would do that repeatedly just to get my parents jailed. That's what you get for forcing me to go to church. And speaking of church, Sunday in Nebraska apparently was so sacred that they had specific Sunday laws. Specifically, no dancing, no horse racing, no playing ball, no fishing, just pretty much no fun on Sunday. If they caught you having fun, you would probably be dragged to church where they would assure you that fun was not invited in the building. That law in particular makes the whole Children of the Corn thing way more believable. Like, yeah, you know what? The kids definitely wanted to rebel because, well, they couldn't do anything fun, so you know what? It's just time to kill the adults. They're clearly ruining everything here. Weird laws aside, this state does have some pretty cool metal bands. Not a tremendous amount. In fact, this one I really did have to go digging, so only part of this I have like physical media for, but one of them I did end up ordering because I liked it so much. But we're going to kick this off with a really strange band called Pariah with their second album, the Barnacle Cordious. This is the second and, as it stands, final full length from this Omaha-based progressive metal slash grindcore, mathcore, metalcore. This band is very strange, or rather was. I feel like I can say is just because this band has released some singles over the last couple of years, but in terms of like their profile, they are so listed as broken up. Either way, this band is hard to pigeonhole, and this is kind of where I got into them. I did get their first album, which is decidedly different. This is the one that really kind of like pushed their sound into a more progressive kind of realm. Like, it's still bonkers, it's still loaded with just strange transitions, alarm clock riffs, you know, the classic like converge, botch, coalesce kind of thing, but also like some stuff that reminds me a lot of like early Between the Buried Me, or even a band like Thought Industry, where it is just wildly experimental, sometimes transitioning not only in terms of like, you know, like riff structure and such, but like transitioning into like a completely different genre. Occasionally you'll get moments on here where they will pair like these weird, distant, atonal, squawky riffs with funk-laden bass lines and very like jazz-laden drum patterns. And on top of that, you'll have like hardcore roars and shrieks and occasionally like death metal moments, but those can give way to like clean vocals, which are very odd in terms of their delivery, and a lot of like bright shimmering melodies, the stuff that you would kind of associate with like later Cave-In. The melodic side of this band is very strange. Like, there are not a lot of traditional melodies, like songs like Pish Posh or Circus or the last track, I've Never Been Here Before in a Long Time, which is a very confusing title. A lot of the time the melodies are infectious, but they're very clever. They're not, you know, very standard. Like, you're not gonna find a lot of like stock anything on here. In fact, Pish Posh is an absolutely wild instrumental track loaded with, again, like transitions into different territories. Lots of shreddy leads. It has a way more like kind of straightforward progressive metal sound in spots, but it also kind of gets into like more like strange polyrhythmic metal, like, you know, some of it kind of comparable to like Animals as Leaders, you know, decidedly less genty though. But on the same album, you can get these just absolutely punishing, just vicious breakdowns like the title track or the Wallaby Dance Machine. The song titles in here are just fucking nuts. And I really enjoy the production on here because this album is very busy. Lots and lots of crazy transitions and lots of like just notes and riff patterns and just bonkers playing. But all of it stands out because you can hear all of it. You can hear the really cool funky bass lines, the crazy guitar work, and, you know, the amazing drum performance on here. All the performances individually are bonkers, but all of this comes together really well. And I like that weird fearlessness about just like kind of going where the song takes them, like the song B, just simply B-E. There are some really solid flat out death metal breakdowns and like just kind of freakouts in there, all scattered around this just strange, bonkers, like proggy, almost kind of math metal. In terms of like the more contemporary stuff, I would say like the longer instrumental tracks in here are a little bit more straightforward, or at least as straightforward as this album gets. But this whole album, I think, is absolutely awesome, and I hadn't jammed it in a while. I would say that this leads a little bit more on the prog side for a good chunk of this. It's definitely more progressive than their first album, but I can't speak about the other singles that they've released since kinda breaking up. But who knows, maybe those are awesome too. I probably should check them out. But yeah, if you like, again, like BT Bam, Coalesce, Botch, you know, a little bit of Cave-In here and there. Thought Industry, I think, is very comparable too. Check this album out. This thing is just wacky and fun. Xenomorph, Empyreal Regimes. This is the lone full length from this Omaha death metal act. At one point, this band featured Bill Taylor, formerly of Immolation, Angel Corpse, and Perdition Temple, though I believe he was playing bass instead of guitar on this. I picked this up a while ago on a trip down to Florida. I had heard about this album, and me being a giant fan of the whole Alien franchise, it's kind of hard for me to pass up just the novelty alone, even though I don't necessarily think the themes are centered around that franchise, but I mean, you know, artwork like that's gonna grab me every time. But musically, this is just some solid old school death metal bordering on technical / progressive death metal. There's a lot of stuff on here that I would compare to like later death, like around Human and Individual Thought Patterns, though where those albums definitely kind of push in a more progressive direction overall and probably more melodic. This stays more sinister, kind of dark, but it is very technical and very intricate when it comes down the riff work. In a way, kind of comparable to like Carcass, I would say like circa Necroticism, or Nocturnus. There's actually some stuff in here that's kind of comparable to the Key, though not synth heavy, but in terms of like riff intricacy and really interesting transitions, kind of close. Not a lot of blast beats. This is definitely more groove laden. I believe Subspecies is possibly the only song on the album that has like a big blast beat section on it. But a lot of this is just based on like more intricate groove laden patterns and absolutely scorching riffs. Songs like the closer Biomechanics and Plight of the Cimmerian, those songs are chock full of these like twisting angular riffs and just very like just dark, sinister sounding melodies. In fact, there's like a fair amount of atmosphere in here when it comes down to like building up songs or building in transitions, which is nice because there's a lot of like super sharp transitions. Like transition wise, I would say they're kind of close to like Immolation in that regard. I will say that the production here is a tad on the raw side, and this is a reissue on Dark Descent, so I imagine they probably did like a little bit in the way of like remastering it or just kind of giving it like a fresh coat of paint, but it still does sound really muddy. And I like 90s death metal production overall, but this one, you know, it's not like well mixed muddy, it's just still kind of muddy. And it can be all over the place for sure, but I mean, overall I dig it. Like this is kind of like a riff buffet. And it's a shame this band didn't continue on past this. I believe one of their members did pass. Plus this coming out in 1995, that was kind of like the beginning of the end, actually kind of middle of the end for death metal's big run there. And being in kind of an isolated scene out in Omaha, yeah, you know, there's not a lot of like bands to tour with. You don't have like a huge, you know, support group around you in terms of like other bands doing kind of the same thing. But either way, this is a pretty solid album. And honestly, we might do a more in-depth retro view of this since this is kind of a one and done. But yeah, if you're a big fan of death, again, Nocturnus, a little bit of Immolation, and maybe like Discarnate as well, check this album out, pretty damn good. Trillion-ton beryllium ships, The Mind Like Fire Unbound. This is the third album from this Lincoln-based stoner doom act, and this was one that I had to go searching for. I ended up jamming their album on Bandcamp, and then luckily this band had CDs, so I ordered it because I really enjoyed this thing. They were also cool enough to send me a bonus, which I think this is a compilation of 2 of their EPs, which I might go over in a collection update at some point, but thank you guys. But this is really interesting stoner doom because it doesn't necessarily follow a lot of the tropes of stoner doom all the time. Immediately, the opening track, Bugs, caught me off guard. While it definitely had all the tropes of stoner doom, like those droning, thick, sludgy guitars, a more, you know, slow, methodical pace. One of the first vocals I heard on here were gutturals, and like legit like death metal, death doom gutturals. That is not that common with this style in general. Generally you get those like more droning cleans like, you know, Monolord and stuff like that. But right out of the riff, we have gutturals. And then immediately following that track with Dark Forest, you have blast beats and a notably more like flat out aggressive stoner doom song. Like it's faster, but it still maintains that sort of atmosphere. And again, the thick, sludgy guitars. So 2 tracks in, this band had me captivated by them kind of like stepping outside of the box in terms of just, you know, stoner doom in general. Now I did get into the more like straightforward stuff that I expect from stoner doom. The title track, the big closer, big droning synths, it's slow, it's plodding, it just lives for the atmosphere. Every note that carries just drones on into space. Infinite Inertia has this really beautiful, clean build-in, and honestly, it has like a more depressive vibe. Like it kind of reminded me a bit more of Pallbearer. But it was the stuff that they did outside of the tropes of the genre that I thought was really cool and how cleverly they're injected. Like despite the title being, again, predominantly a slow, droning song, There's a brief section of blast beats in there where it kind of just shifts gears for a bit and then transitions out of it into like some really cool, just atmospheric melodies. This thing has some violent mood swings, but it really works. And like, I was kind of like drawn into this one, but this was just like a ton of fun to listen to. Like, it has all the things that I like about bands like Sleep, Monolord, and Truck Fighters, stuff like that. But again, it's these little like weird nuances they throw in there to kind of break it up a little bit and make you go, wait, huh? And honestly, if you're a big Stoner Doom fan, of course, you're going to find, you know, all the stuff that you like about Stoner Doom. But if you want to hear some stuff that's a little bit outside of the box in terms of this genre, check this album out. This thing was fun from front to back. And again, thank you guys for sending me the bonus comp. I will get to that eventually. It'll probably be in a collection update. But this, absolute banger right here. Check it out. All right, now we're going to get into the stuff that I don't own physical media for. And this is, again, like the stuff that I had to go hunting for because I really didn't have much from the state. But once again, through a lot of searching, I did find some cool stuff. And one that I wanted to bring up here was the band Orpheus with their lone full-length Cast into Oblivion. This was an Omaha death metal act. This album came out in 2020, and then the band broke up in 2022. They actually featured a member, or at least a one-time member of the band Gorgatron. And that was enough for me to actually check them out because I do really dig that band. And this is some really raw, really gritty death metal. The production here definitely has a demo-ish sort of vibe. It's, again, very gritty sounding. The guitars on here are absolutely huge, possibly overdriven because they absolutely dominate the mix. But I mean, this is death metal. You want big guitars. And this is, I don't know if I would necessarily call it like technical or progressive, but it's definitely not just like old school death metal where it's, you know, the very straightforward song structure, you know, like double time stuff, a lot of hefty chugging. There's a lot of intricacy to this. There's a lot of stuff in here that is kind of in that overlap between like death and atheist. You have alternating vocals on here, like ghastly howls, deep roars. Some of the stuff on here honestly kind of reminds me a bit of Horrendous. Lots of crazy transitions and crazy riff changes. Like, this album is very busy with riffs. Songs like the title track, Wrongful Death, Seat of the Godhead. Awesome riff changes in those songs in particular. They keep the songs like really interesting because you get these like frequent transitions. And some of the transitions on here can be very sharp, very jagged, but it kind of works with that more like technical aspect. Eater of Light in particular, that song has, you know, elements that I would say are very similar to like later Gore Guts or even Cryptopsy. And there is some like flat out brutal shit on here too. But me personally, I kind of like the old school flair that's on here, especially in the song 666, which of course, if you have a song called 666, it should be a banger. And that one is. A lot of thrashy riffs on there. It's just a fun, energetic, bombastic song. It kind of strips back some of the technical aspects just to kind of just riff it out. On the other side of the spectrum, the song Meditative Misanthrope kind of lets the more melodic aspects come to the forefront a bit. And I like the fact that there are some instrumentals here to kind of like spice it up a little bit. I like a good instrumental every now and then. Wrongful Death, I love that song front to back. That is, I think, one of the strongest songs on here. But also Trail of Sin too, I think, is a really good standout. The whole album, the thing that I really like is it is technical. It does have like progressive elements, but it's very like just straight up death metal first. Like, you know, the progressive technical elements are just listening to like just straight out like old school death metal. If you're a big fan again of, you know, death, atheist, you know, later Gore Guts in terms of the more technical aspects, but also like early Morbid Angel, Malevolent Creation, just straight up Cannibal Corpse too. Check this album out, really solid find. I don't know if there are CDs out there, but if I can find one, I will definitely get it. The next one I have for you is Garoted, Visions of Death and Destruction. This is the second album from this Lincoln-based death metal act that has since moved to Kansas City. Yet another one that I had to go digging for and kind of sift through a lot of the different Garoteds out there because there's a fair amount. In fact, I own a different Gerotted that actually has ties to Atheist. They're from, I believe, Massachusetts. But this band pretty much grabbed me right away with just how flat out dark and brutal this is. This is kind of along the lines of like Incantation, Funeral Brahm, and like a little bit of like Angel Corpse as well because it's very busy with riffs, but it is just on the nose, brutal as hell, pretty much at all times. I'd also even compare this to like Morta Skald, especially in like some of the groovier moments, and even Aeon too. again, a band that is just known for flat out brutality. While I love like all the relentless chugging and like gnarly tremolos on here, I will say that I'm not a big fan of the drum sound on here. It just sounds a little too raw and it doesn't cut through the mix particularly well. At least that's just what I think. But in terms of the songs themselves, I dig them. They are very straightforward. They're very hefty. I like the thrashy sections that occasionally show up, especially on Under the Infernal Legions. There's a lot of like fun blasphemous titles on here. And Mortal Sacrilege in particular too. While that song is a little bit more on the groovy side, they do throw in a really nice, well-placed Slayer scream, which is kind of outside of the vocal box on here because a lot of the vocals are just straight up death metal vocals, kind of a mid to low range. Those thrashy wails kind of pop up periodically too, and I think they kind of add like a fun flavor. Speaking of additional flavors, Demonic Nightmare actually kind of sounds a little bit more like blackened. And that definitely fits with the themes. You get these like hefty, but like very cold, icy tremolos. It just has that more like black metal vibe to it. And Vigils of Suicide in particular, I would say is like one of the heaviest cuts. It actually feels a little bit more akin to like brutal death metal. You have gravity blasts, you get big old like chunky chromatic riffs. The whole album, I think, is pretty solid. And, you know, production aside, the only issue I had with this, and I don't think it's the band's fault, it's probably fucking Spotify's fault because every track on here seemed like it had a long period of silence at the end, but that was just pretty much Spotify, I would say. Like, I'm reasonably sure if you listen to this on YouTube, you're not going to get those long pauses in between tracks, but on Spotify, just be prepared for 15 to 30 seconds of silence between most of the tracks. I don't know why it uploaded like that, but, that was just something I noticed. But outside of that, this thing is absolutely savage. And if you're a big fan, again, of Angel Corpse, and again, if you're a big fan of like Angel Corpse, Funeral Brahm, like those two in particular, but again, also like a little bit of Aeon too, and occasionally some Deicide. Check this album out. I definitely want to find some of this band stuff. I do believe they have CDs, but I just couldn't find any. But yeah, this is just absolutely disgusting. Next up, and kind of a blast from the past for me, because I remember hearing this band and samplers like years ago, actually all the way around like 2006, and thinking that Bruce Dickinson actually fronted this band. Anyway, we have Cellador with their debut album, Enter Deception. Now this is a little bit different for me because this kind of goes into a realm that I'm not the biggest fan of, though occasionally some bands do grab my ear, because this is power metal / heavy metal. Now first off, while they did start in Omaha, they did move to Denver, and there has been some lineup changes, and I haven't heard anything past this album. But this is definitely in the realm of power metal, and I know I bitch about that stuff all the time, though I will admit that US power metal generally does have a heavier vibe, and when it's mixed with something else, like in this case, I would say a hefty dose of thrash metal and heavy metal, I can kind of get into it, because this album is just chock full of riffs, chock full of melodies, and the frontman on here really does sound like Bruce Dickinson a lot. Like, he has not only his inflection, the vibrato, but even like the voice itself, like there's like a little bit of gruffness to it, and just the way he says things, it kind of sounds like Bruce Dickinson. Now the songs that I remembered hearing were the songs Leaving All Behind and Never Again. Both of those I thought were really good standouts. Lots of galloping drums and shreddy guitars and tons of lead work. Like, this band, there's some comparisons you could probably make to Dragon Force in terms of like the shreddy wankery, but I feel like this band is a little bit more focused on the songs. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely cheese here, but there's not like Dragon Force levels of cheese. But where they overlap, I mean, you have, I believe, 2 lead guitarists on here. You have frequent lead trade-offs. And you do occasionally have sections where they kind of skip the thrash gallop and go right into a blast beat to kind of add a little bit more fiery intensity to it. But for the most part, it's just kind of a fast gallop pace. The songs, I think, are fun and infectious and built on some pretty solid choruses. A Sign Far Beyond, Forever Unbound, like, the big galloping riffs, lots of killer harmonies. And in terms of like being a more melody-centric band, it still does pack like a good punch to it. Like, I need some sort of level of aggression, at least in terms of like most of my metal. And power metal, or at least like European power metal, I feel like kind of just traipses into songs that are just too major chord driven. there's enough stuff to break this up that actually kind of held my interest a bit. Forever Unbound and Never Again, I would say, are like two big standouts, not only for the aggressive, like heavy chugging on them. It feels a little bit more like, you know, mean, a little bit more tough, because power metal I often don't really associate with the word tough. Like even when they're slaying mythical dragons in their songs, I'm probably rooting for the dragon. But again, they break up stuff pretty well. Releasing the Shadow has like some brief like death metal tremolos, like you can definitely hear the tonal change. It's got, you know, like more of a Morbid Angel sort of vibe, albeit being played by Dragon Force. Like there's definitely some Dragon Force comparisons, especially since like a lot of the leads are, you know, very neoclassical, like See Through Time, they're neoclassical as hell. But for the most part, I would say it's fun, it's entertaining. I actually still appreciate this. I will say that I think the mix is a bit flat, and this was actually produced by Eric Rutan, or at least mixed and mastered by it. And this doesn't have like his usual like over-the-top production that you would hear in like Hate Eternal or Cannibal Corpse. So he did kind of adapt to like a different band here. But overall, the album just feels kind of like brick-walled overall. At some points, I feel like the vocals kind of sound a little bit dry, but overall, I think this album's pretty fun. Again, I'm not the biggest power metal fan. I'm very selective about this stuff, but I liked this album for the kind of just riffy energy that it had. And again, I kind of like this dude's vocals, so I don't believe he's actually in the band anymore. Either way, if you're a big fan of Iron Maiden, I'm throwing Dragon Force, and maybe just like a little bit of like Crimson Glory, check this out, give it a whirl. Again, I'm not entirely sure this band's still putting out music, but this one was definitely worth checking out. All right, next up we have Diabolic Possession with their Ripped in Pieces demo. Now this is the third demo from this Omaha-based death metal act. This act may or may not be together anymore. Really not sure. I pulled this one pretty much just going down the rabbit hole with some of the different bands on here. Mainly because this band shares members with Cellador, and this also shares members with Xenomorph. But in a surprise twist, this also shares members with Propane. But I decided to check it out and ended up really digging it. This is just gritty, old school 90s death metal. I mean, it sounds like a death metal demo that came out in the 90s, namely because it is. But this thing is just chock full of just gnarly riffs, really cool transitions. Love the vocals. The vocals on here are delightfully over the top. This guy goes from like these ghastly over the top screams, like not quite like the John Tardy like drawn out ones, but you know, it's kind of got that same sort of flair to it. But then he'll swing over to like these like deep throaty gurgles. But the main thing I love in here is the music, and musically, honestly, a lot of this kind of sounds like Altars of Madness. Like this kind of has that, you know, very early Morbid Angel sound where there was still like a lot of thrash in it. But in terms of like the riff construction, you know, there's a little bit more distance. The leads on here are wild as hell. The title track in particular, honestly, it sounds like a deep cut from Altars of Madness. But you have songs that are a little bit more groove laden. Reign and Terror is a little bit slower, a little bit more menacing. It still keeps that overall very Morbid Angel ambiance to it. And much like that album, you have like a lot of like fun songwriting dynamics, like these speed ups and slowdowns on Cranial Meiosis. I don't know if I even spelled that right, but that song frequently caveats between like slow, menacing sections to these like fast, thrashy, bitey sections. From the Gates of Hell also does that a little bit too. Now this was a shorter offering, so there's really not much for me to talk about other than I do like every track on here. This definitely has like that, you know, just 90s death metal sound, and maybe like a little bit of that late 80s death metal sound where it was still very much rooted in thrash, or at least here in the US, because a lot of our death metal kind of came out of the thrash scene. But this band had like kind of nothing but demos, I believe, all throughout the 90s, and then they didn't put out their first full length until 2004. And I kind of wonder if, you know, once again, like the failure to launch in terms of like putting out like a full length or like something a little bit more polished outside of a demo was the fact that, you know, once again, Nebraska is a very like isolated area, or at least in terms of like scenes, there's really not a huge metal scene there. Much like I brought up in Oklahoma with Power Lord, you know, having a scene around a band, or at least, you know, with other bands kind of like flourishing in it, that kind of helps propel the other bands. Like the old saying that a rising tide raises all ships. Sadly, there really wasn't much of a tide in Omaha. So this demo may not have got a lot of traction, and because it came out in 1993, that was kind of when, like, you know, the stock started kind of dropping out the bottom for death metal, at least in that early run. Which sucks because 93 is still chock full of like killer death metal. It's just at that point, you know, the mainstream, they kind of had their focus on it for a little bit, and then they just immediately left for, I believe, the groove metal scene. Either way, this is a really solid demo. Chock full of riffs, good 90s death metal energy. Once again, I'm not entirely sure how much there is in the way of physical media for this. I'm definitely going to look around. I mean, if it's just like tapes and such, I'll probably skip that, but this was a solid listen overall. If you're a big fan of like specifically Floridian death metal, like again, Morbid Angel, bit of Deicide, Obituary, and I would even say like Malevolent Creation and some of the more thrashy sections too. Check this demo out. It's pretty solid. And that will do it for Nebraska. Yet another short one, but again, I kind of like doing these because it gives me a chance to search outside of what I have in my collection. And even when we get down to more sparsely populated states, I still have a long list of stuff to go through that I've been kind of compiling for these states where I really wasn't sure how much I would have to talk about. Either way, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We also have memberships. They are only 99 cents, and our Lone Perk is doing a members-only live stream, which we will probably do at some point. It kind of depends on when you're seeing this. You're definitely seeing this after I got back from MDF, but I shot it before we went, so it might be like a June one. I don't know. Either way, membership's the main way to support the channel now. We also still have our store, thrallsmetal.com, with our t-shirts and hats. That is linked down below. And of course, there is a join button down there for you to just smash, punch, kick, I don't know, whatever. Don't like damage your shit too much, but you know, press it with some authority. And of course, thank you guys so much for liking, subscribing, following, sharing, all the cool stuff you guys do to keep this channel growing. We appreciate the hell out of it. It has just been amazing seeing this channel grow over the years, and we're looking forward to overloading you guys with more content in the future. So one more big thank you, because you guys are awesome, and we will catch you later.